Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Advantage webinar on tackling prerequisites. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Bianca, and I'm a team member here at Inspira Advantage. We are an academic consultation group, and we are committed to helping students get into their dream pre-health programs. Today, we're going to be talking about medical school prerequisites. I am going to go over our agenda for the day. So we are going to start it off with some introductions. We have our two panelists with us here, Costner and Sunjay. And then we're going to talk about some course requirements for med school. Then we'll talk about how you can plan your prerequisites and give you some tips on how you can plan and choose your courses. And then after that, we'll go into a little Q&A. There should be a Q&A box somewhere on your screen, and you can pop your questions in if you have any. So let's get started with some introductions. Whoever wants to take the floor is free to do so.
Hi, everyone. My name is Costner Mackenzie. I'm excited to meet all of you and provide some guidance or advice as you all embark upon your pre-health journey. Just to provide some of my own background, I was a human biology major at Stanford University as an undergrad, and that's really when I began or started my pre-med process. After graduation, I did take a gap year. I actually stayed and worked in Silicon Valley at 23andMe for a year. And during that time, I submitted my applications for medical schools and pre-health programs. And then I ultimately went to medical school at Northwestern University. While I was there, I was an admissions counselor. So I was one of the students that was reading and providing feedback on med school applications. After my time at Northwestern, I applied to residency, and I'm now currently a third-year dermatology resident at NYU. So I'm excited to provide any advice or guidance and discuss today.
Thanks, Costner. Hi, everyone. My name is Sunjay Letchuman. I'm from Shreveport, Louisiana, and I majored in business at Texas A&M University in College Station. And I was super interested in the business of healthcare and health policy, and then ended up at now I'm a first-year medical student at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City. And Costner's many years ahead of me right now, but hopefully I'll go into something like anesthesiology is the plan right now. And I've helped lots of people with their medical school applications, and I'm really excited to share my advice today in the webinar.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. I'm so happy to have you both here. All right, so we're going to jump into your medical school course requirements. Let's get started on why med schools require prerequisites.
Sure. So what we want to make sure is, especially when you get to medical school, that you have some sort of background knowledge of science. And that's like the basis for, why you have to take these prerequisite classes in the first place. And they also help you with the MCAT, which almost all, pre-medical students will have to take. It's important to recognize, though, that each school's prerequisites are a little bit different, even though you see similarities. You'll see most schools have some hours of biology, chemistry, or math, but the numbers of hours may differ. So we're going to talk about that today.
Awesome. And do you have anything to add to that, Costner? I think you're muted.
I agree with everything that Sunjay just said. As we all know, med school it's very difficult, no matter where you are attending medical school. And so these requirements are really a great way for the admissions committees to really evaluate what kind of grasp you have for some of these foundational subjects before you embark on your med school journey.
All right, amazing. Let us move on. We're going to talk about the required prerequisites, kind of minimum requirements and across the board, what you might expect to see as you're looking into applying to med school.
Absolutely. So right now we'll start by just discussing some of the more fundamental prerequisites, which really encompass or embody the science prerequisites. And these are the ones that not only are going to be giving you a lot of the foundational knowledge for a lot of your basic science or the basic curriculum for medical school, but will also be really contributing to your science GPA. So one of the first prereqs that is really required by all medical schools is biology. Typically, medical schools require at a minimum 2 semesters or 3 trimesters, depending on what type of undergraduate curriculum you have. So that typically is at least 1 year of biology courses with labs that are included. And these courses typically cover topics ranging from physiology to genetics to cell biology. And it's really important for every applicant to have a strong understanding of both like living systems as well as biology to not only be successful when they start medical school, but also to help them prepare for the MCAT. Going along with that, chemistry is also a very common prerequisite really across the board. Typically, most medical schools require at least 4 semesters with labs. So that's typically equivalent to about 2 years. Generally, these courses are described as general or intro chemistry, organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, and even biochemistry. And similar to biology, a lot of these chemistry courses do have a laboratory component. And so this is really necessary to have a strong understanding of the reactions within the body that you can then apply to a lot of your preclinical years. And honestly, having a strong chemistry knowledge will even carry forward into your clinical years. And then finally, at least in terms of this slide, physics is another very common prereq across the board. Typically, medical schools require that students have a course which is at least general physics with laboratory. Typically, there aren't many qualifiers aside from about 2 semesters or 1 year of general physics with labs. However, it is important to read up on the schools that you're applying for. For example, there are some medical schools out there that strongly recommend calculus-based physics. So it's just always important that you're doing your due diligence to make sure that all of your prereqs are mapping onto the requirements requested by medical schools.
Awesome. Do you have anything to add to that, Sunjay?
Costner covered it all. Just make sure you look at your school, whatever school you're applying to, what their requirements are, because sometimes that biology requirement's a little bit higher than 2 semesters.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so we have 2 more required prereqs.
Yes, and I'm happy to talk about these because a lot of times these take people by surprise that you have to have math, a 1 semester of math as a prerequisite for medical school. Why would they require that? But the main reason is it's a statistics class, usually some sort of biostatistics or general statistics class, because in medicine, so much of medicine is based on research, and all that research requires a lot of formal statistics. So understanding statistics is actually really important. Some medical schools, especially the top medical schools like Harvard, for example, require 1 semester of calculus. So this is another one to look into to make sure that you just need 1 semester and not more. Now, you also are required to take 2 semesters of English, and this may kind of scare you thinking that you have to take a class in the English department, but that's not necessarily the case. Usually it's just 2 semesters of a writing intensive course counts as those English requirements. So, look into or talk to your pre-med advisor about which courses you're already planning to take that may be considered writing intensive. Usually every major has writing intensive courses worked into them, and those can satisfy this requirement.
Amazing. And do you have anything to add to that, Costner?
No, I think that's a fantastic coverage for these 2 prereqs. And I agree with what you're saying is that mathematics really is something that's going to carry forward to your preclinical and your clinical years. As a future or prospective physician, one of your jobs will be to stay up on current literature and evaluate clinical studies or clinical trials. And oftentimes a lot of the data presented by those studies, which are going to inform your clinical decision-making, are really driven by statistical studies. So I definitely want to drive home the point that having a strong foundation in mathematics isn't only important for your application, but also for your future as a physician.
Amazing. Thank you guys so much. So now that you kind of know what the baseline for your prerequisites are for your med school application, we're going to talk about some recommended courses. And these aren't courses that you will have to take, but they will expand your knowledge and make you a better, well-rounded candidate for med school. So we'll go ahead and get started with that.
Absolutely. So now that we discussed some of the required prerequisites for a lot of the medical schools. Now we get to have a little bit more flexibility in the curriculum or in our scheduling within our undergraduate education. And so some of the recommended courses that we want to discuss today are one, physiology or anatomy. Most schools do have a physiology or anatomy course of some sort. I will say that taking a human physiology course can really give you great insight to a lot of the fascinating biological processes that drive a lot of both normal physiology, but also can provide insight into pathology or sickness, disease that we often at times as physicians are dealing with. And then not only this, but physiology courses can also be extremely beneficial for MCAT preparation. And later on, we will discuss when is the best time to take some of these courses. But just keep in mind that a physiology course, while not necessarily a required prereq, can definitely be something that's beneficial both for your application, but also for your MCAT. Aside from that, psychology and sociology courses can also be incredibly useful. They can help you provide a more holistic perspective of health, of culture, and a lot of the aspects that can inform our decisions as physicians. And then finally, anthropology courses, they can really provide insight as well into different perceptions or beliefs, both inside and outside of medicine. And so depending upon your curriculum that's offered at your medical school, anthropology can definitely be an asset. And then I just wanted to make one note that when applying to medical schools, if there are some programs that you are incredibly interested in, it is important to look into what exactly their requirements are, because there are some schools, for example, that may not have just a pure English requirement, but they may require that you have courses spread out across English, history, sociology, and psychology. And so these are some of the important things that you can think of when not only reviewing your prereqs, but also recommended courses.
Amazing. And do you have anything to add to that, Sunjay?
Cosmic covered it all.
Beautiful. All right. So, yes, as Costner had mentioned, while these courses aren't mandatory, they'll give you a broader sense of the things you need to know as you embark on your journey to becoming a doctor. Do you want to say anything, Sunjay, along these lines?
Yeah, definitely. I highly encourage students to explore beyond the prerequisite courses or even science courses in general. Medical schools are trying to, when they're selecting a class, like create an orchestra. Everyone can't just play one instrument. So you want to make yourself interesting in some way, have some sort of different background, because that's part of diversity and of course culture, background, but of major as well. So like I was a business major in college, and so many of my courses were related to the business of healthcare, which kind of gave me a different perspective as I was going through the application process. So I encourage you, like Costner said, to explore your other interests outside of just the normal prereqs of medical school.
Beautifully said, you guys. All right, so now that you know what you should be taking in preparation for med school, we're going to talk about how you can plan these courses to work in your benefit. All right, Sunjay, do you want to take this one?
Sure. So this is super important to do because, as we emphasize, all medical schools have slightly different requirements in terms of prerequisites. So the first step in planning out what prerequisites you have to take, whatever stage you're in undergrad, is to look at those specific schools. Sometimes it's a little easy, like if you're applying to Texas schools, all Texas schools are under one application, so it's easy to see what the prereqs are. But in other states, different schools in the same state can have different requirements. So this can be super easy by looking on to like the AAMC website, or the easiest thing in my opinion is just looking up the name of the school and putting medical school prerequisites. So that's a great place to start.
Awesome. And do you have anything? Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the medical school websites can be a great place to find the required recommendations, as well as the AAMC. And one piece of advice that I give to anyone that's preparing for their pre-health process is to plan early. Because if you are planning early, then you have the time, you have the foresight to really set yourself up for success so that you're not scrambling and having any regrets about courses that you wish you had taken in the past. So the earlier that you prepare your courses, the better.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So let's move on to the next slide. We'll talk a bit about when you should be taking your courses. Costner, do you want to take this one?
Absolutely. So when you are taking your courses, it's really a very individual decision. So when I am providing advice to a student, I really want to get a sense of what their goals are and when they want to, in terms, apply to medical school. So a few things that I think of are one, when are you taking the MCAT? As we mentioned earlier, there are certain courses like human physiology or chemistry, which are very highly tested on the MCAT. And so it's important to take those courses early enough that you have a strong foundational knowledge, which you can then apply to your standardized testing. Another thing to think about is when you're taking these courses relative to one another. Because while it's important to take all of these prereqs and recommended courses before entering medical school, you want to take them in a way where you can really be successful across the board. And so that may mean not piling all of your most difficult courses into the same semester, but rather spreading them out across your undergraduate timeline so that you're able to really invest the time necessary to be successful. And then the final thing that I really want to highlight is that it's important to really think about what your timeline for applying is. There are many students now that decide to take a gap year or that may decide that they want to take courses during the summer. And so if that's the case, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I don't think medical schools look down upon taking courses either during the summer or during a gap year. And if you do take a little bit more time to apply, that can give you some more flexibility on when you're taking these courses. So these are all some important factors or questions to think about when you're building out your timeline of when to take these courses. And once again, the earlier you're asking these questions, the earlier you're preparing, the more successful you'll be.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So we're going to get into these individual things a little bit more in the next slide. So let us talk about some things to consider as well. Sunjay?
Of course. And Costner covered so many things that are really important in terms of how you can find a balance. And what one important thing that he said was that you don't want to take, all the extremely hard classes together in one semester. You may be overwhelmed. And one of the reasons you don't want to do that is not only because your extracurriculars will suffer, but your GPA may suffer as well. And maintaining a high GPA is really important for medical school. There are a few factors that are really important in terms of your application, and two of those are your GPA and your MCAT score. So, try to kind of level out all the courses across your years, so that you're not overloading yourself.
Awesome. Do you have anything to add, Costner? I know you'd spoken on this.
Yeah, I think Sunjay really brought it home with this one. I think one other comment I just make is to really be honest with yourself. I think sometimes there's this expectation or this thought that more is always more, but you'll find yourself in a much better place when you're applying if you are honest with yourself, you recognize what your limitations are and what your bandwidth is, and really try to not bite off more than you can chew. Because as Sunjay mentioned, your GPA is a very important factor in your application. And so you really want to protect it and make sure that you are putting your best foot forward throughout your undergraduate timeline.
Beautiful. All right. So we'll move on to the next thing, which is considering your MCAT test date. Costner?
Absolutely. So having a strong idea of when you're taking your MCAT can also help dictate or at least guide when you are taking some of these courses. And so as I mentioned earlier, in addition to some of the required prereqs like your chemistry courses or your biology courses, there may be some recommended courses like human physiology, for example, or even psychology, which is tested on the MCAT as well, that you may want to plan to take before your MCAT. And then tying this into the last slide as well in terms of bandwidth, also try to take courses in preparation for your MCAT when you do have the bandwidth. And so oftentimes some students take an extra MCAT prep course, and oftentimes those can be very time intensive and very demanding. And so try not to pile those into a time in your undergraduate time and when you're also taking very demanding courses like biology or chemistry, for example.
Amazing. And do you have anything to add to that, Sanjay?
Costner covered it all.
All right, beautiful. So we have one last thing here that we're going to dive into a little bit more, your application timeline.
Yeah, and we talked about this so briefly, taking gap years is becoming very common nowadays. Like, for example, the average age of my medical school class, like incoming class, is like 24, 25. And usually across medical schools, it's not 22. And that's because a lot of students are taking gap years. So you want to think about, when will you be applying? Will you be applying the summer between your junior and senior year, which is typically the earliest that you would apply? Or do you plan on, studying longer for the MCAT, taking a year to do research, boosting up your resume, or just doing something else, fun outside of science before going to medical school? These are all things to consider when you think about when you want to apply. It's just also important to remember that some things expire. For example, your MCAT score does expire after a certain number of years, and so do some of your prerequisite courses, because medical schools want that information, that science knowledge, to be up to date in your mind before you get started. So that's kind of the logic behind it.
Awesome. And do you have anything else to add to this, Costner?
Yeah, I think that was a fantastic kind of review of when you should be applying. And one small comment I also just wanted to make is that it's never too late. And so, there are plenty of prereqs that are required, as well as all of these courses. But I have plenty of colleagues who maybe decided that they wanted to go to medical school their junior or even their senior year of undergraduate education. But there's still time, and there are plenty of post-bac programs, for example, where you may decide, oh, I actually do want to go to medical school, but I no longer have the time to do all of these requirements before I graduate. That's okay. There are plenty of post-bac programs that will help you meet a lot of these requirements and help you prepare for an application, even if you didn't necessarily partake in them while you were an undergrad.
Amazing. Very beautifully said, you guys. All right, so we're going to move on to the last section, which is going over some tips on how you can plan and tackle your prerequisites. All right, let's get started on that.
Yeah, so at this point, we just want to touch upon some tips that can really help you all prepare to succeed. And we want to discuss being strategic, knowing your limits, and really solidifying your med school plan. So as we have mentioned, it really is essential to know what the prereqs are for the programs that you're interested in. So this requires that you're really planning ahead and that you're mapping out which courses you're going to take, so that by the time you are preparing your application, all of those requirements and recommended courses have been met. So really plan ahead and be strategic in terms of when you're taking these courses to really set yourself up for success and to really optimize your GPA and optimize your performance. And part of being strategic is really knowing your limits. So as we mentioned, you have plenty of time to prepare an application. So don't feel as if you need to burden yourself with all of the prereqs, all of the extracurriculars, all of the MCAT prep at one time. The more that you can really space things out to allow yourself to have the bandwidth to give everything the attention and the time that it really needs to be successful is really important. And then finally, it's important to really solidify your med school plans. So when you are planning on applying to medical schools, know what schools you're applying to before you map out all of your prerequisites. Even though we gave a general guideline for what some of the recommendations for, there are definitely schools out there that do have some unique or niche requirements. And so you don't want to find yourself in a place where you are about submit your application and you find out that that one dream school you may have had has a requirement that you weren't unaware of. So make sure to plan ahead, be strategic, and then really solidify your med school plan before applying.
And do you have anything to add to that, Sunjay?
Costner covered it all.
All right, beautiful. So we got a few more tips for you guys. take the
Yeah,
floor.
of course. It's super important to know, what all the requirements are for each medical school that you're applying to. Because yes, there are prereq requirements, but there also may be some other requirements that you don't want to miss, like how many letters of recommendation does this specific school require, or maybe they want you to have a committee letter. There are all these different, specific school requirements. So just do as thorough research as possible. And that's where your pre-med advisor at your school can help. The pre-med advisor has usually overseen or personally mentored hundreds of students who are applying to medical school. They're generally speaking intimately familiar with the medical schools that are in their area and some that are much more broad. So they'll be able to guide you on when the best time is to take certain prereqs, potentially even what professors may be best to take for certain classes, which professors may be harder or not. So really lean on those people who have already gone down this path, so you're not doing things on your own. And also, you want to be doing all the science stuff, but really find other extracurriculars and activities that boost your application and make you more, like well-rounded individual, and just help you out in the whole process for applying to medical school. Because on the AMCAS application, there'll be a section for, your clinical experiences and also your non-clinical experiences. So that's where you can, show how your prereqs kind of taught you things that helped when you're volunteering in the hospital, you're applying what you learned, but then they also, studying anthropology or something else helped somewhere else. So those are some more tips.
Beautiful. Do you have anything to add to that, Costner?
No, I think that was fantastic. I just wanted to make one point, which is that seeing all of this information and all of these requirements can seem very daunting. And that's because it is a lot. There are plenty of requirements, not only in terms of curriculum, but also extracurriculars. And there is a lot that goes into your medical school application. But if you do plan ahead, then you can really chip away at a lot of these requirements over years in a way that will really prepare you to succeed. And just also recognize that everyone has a different pre-health journey. And so don't feel like your path needs to be the same as someone sitting next to you in class. Everyone can get to their goals as a prospective physician in their own way.
Amazing. So beautifully said, you guys. Thank you so much. So now we are going to move on to the part of the webinar where you get to ask your questions. So we're going to wait for those questions to come in. And in the meantime, I would like to ask our panelists if they have any words of wisdom, or maybe there was something that wasn't covered, any stories that you might want to tell. Yeah.
Yeah, I can get started. And this may be a funny piece of advice, but with interviews, you get all sorts of questions. And for some reason, one thing that was very valuable that I did was I just read I've always read a lot of books, and reading books, especially like books sometimes related to healthcare, some of the big books in healthcare, like Being Mortal or other books related specifically to health policy, can really help you answer some questions in the interview. They come up in interesting ways, and it can also separate yourself from other applicants. So consider, if you've never read like a healthcare specific book, consider picking one up.
That's great advice. Definitely agree with all of that. And then one piece or one comment I want to make is that I also don't think you can ever go wrong by participating or diving deeper into any of your interests or passions. And that does not need to be related to the biological sciences or chemistry. That can be art, music, athletics, economics, whatever it may be. If you have a passion or an interest, you really should nurture that, because it's only going to make your application stronger. And as someone who has sat on an admissions committee, it's great and fascinating to hear about people that have interest within and outside of healthcare. And so if you have something that you really want to pursue as an undergrad, go for it. It's only going to make you a stronger applicant, and it just takes a little planning to also fit in those prereqs.
Amazing. All right, so let's get started on some questions. We have a question here. What are your recommendations for choosing a major? And are there benefits to having to being a dedicated pre-med major?
I can start and then Costner can take it from here, especially because I was a business major, so it's a little bit different. I'm like a huge believer in majoring in what you're like super interested in, what you want to study, especially because in my mind, I'll be doing medicine and science for the rest of my life. So this was a perfect opportunity in these 4 years to study something else that I was super interested in, while also taking all the prereqs for sciences. So I'm covering that base. And I really do think that it makes you stand out in your medical school application. It makes you more interesting. And you'd be surprised by the number of fields that intersect with medicine. You know, from my perspective, I see healthcare as a huge business, one of the biggest businesses in America. So being able to study business and accounting and finance helped me understand the business of healthcare much better. There were classes called the business of healthcare that I took that I was able to talk about in my interview. And I ended up doing business of healthcare research that was informative as well. So I definitely recommend not just, majoring in sciences unless that's what you absolutely want to study. Major in what you really love.
I couldn't agree more. I think the best thing that you can do during college is really majoring in something that you find the most interesting, because that's something that you're then going to be able to talk about during interviews with passion. And it most of the time also reflects itself in your performance. So if you are incredibly engaged in your major, it's more likely that you will also excel, and that's going to be reflected in your GPA. I myself was a human biology major, which did tend to be more of a pre-med kind of classical track. I think the primary benefit of being on a pre-med or a human biology track through your major is that it can make it a bit simpler to complete some of these prereqs that we've discussed. And so for me as a human biology major, a lot of the biology, a lot of the chemistry, and a lot of the physics requirements were already built into my major curriculum. Now, with that said, I think it's incredibly possible to still fulfill those prereqs with a major that could be business, it could be economics, it might be music or art, whatever it is. You can still fulfill all of these prereqs while still being a major that's not necessarily pre-med.
All right, amazing. We'll move on to the next question. Do you guys have any specific tips on how to balance my prerequisite courses if I'm not a pre-med major?
Yeah, I can get us started. It just requires a lot of planning, and it also, for example, with business, I chose not to major in something specific in business, like finance or accounting, because it required even more courses in that major that gave me even less time to do the prereqs. So it just requires you to really look at like, okay, how can I like still major in something that's not science, but then like fit all these other science classes in, and that may require you to take fewer of your major specific courses, so that you can fit those science classes in. But it just requires a lot of planning, and that's where your pre-health advisor could help.
Absolutely. And I think one point I also just want to drive home is when you're really assessing your bandwidth, don't just consider the courses you're taking, but also think about what other commitments you have in terms of extracurriculars or even your personal life. If you are an athlete, you might want to take a less intensive course load when you're on season. If you are involved in student government, there may be times when you are planning more events or when you are helping with policy a little bit more. And so those may also be times that you want to not necessarily plan some of the courses that are going to take more time and energy. So really think about your time holistically, and protect it in a way that you will be most successful.
Beautifully said. All right. Next question we have here is, when is the best time to take my prerequisites / when should I start? And would you suggest taking pre-med courses in the summer? Are there any pros and cons to that?
Yeah, I can get us started. Usually chemistry is a class because you have to take so many semesters of chemistry. You take one full year of general chemistry and then a whole year of organic chemistry traditionally. That one started at the very beginning, like your first semester of college. It doesn't have to be, but that's traditionally how it goes. And one class that's very popularly taken over the summer is physics. So you'll find if you talk to a lot of pre-med students that a lot of students take physics 1 and 2, the summer after, their sophomore year or even if they're summer after their freshman year, because that one can be kind of hard to fit in to your schedule. But your pre-med advisor usually has like a really good idea of like, when you should be taking these classes. So traditionally students will take like chemistry and biology together their first year, and then, maybe take physics over the summer and then start taking biochemistry starting, the beginning of their junior year or the end of their sophomore year.
Agreed. I think it's very common for schools and different majors to be set up in a way where a lot of the fundamental, like 101 type biology or chemistry courses are taken either your freshman or your sophomore year. I think one of the benefits to taking courses early and on track in that way is that oftentimes a lot of your other peers will be taking those same classes. And so I know that when I was a freshman, a significant portion of my freshman dorm was taking chemistry at the same time. And if you are someone that learns best in a group setting, it can be helpful to have different study groups or having someone across the hall that you can kind of touch base on a problem set with. But with that said, there is not one way to approach these prereqs. And if taking them early is not the path for you, that's perfectly fine. You may be someone that comes into college not even thinking that you want to be a pre-med, and it's not until your junior or your senior year that you recognize that that's something that's really calling to you. And if that's the place that you're at, that's okay. And there's always a way where we can make sure that we're covering these prereqs and really help you prepare your application for your pre-health journey.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. We have next question. Do you guys have any specific recommendations for courses that they should be taking to prepare for the MCAT? I know we've talked about this and we can go over like required prerequisites as well as recommended courses that might help them with MCAT prep and content.
Go ahead, Costner.
I think in terms of content, you really want to be covering a lot of the biological sciences, a lot of the chemistry, and a lot of the humanities that are covered in the MCAT. I do think something like human physiology is also helpful. Typically, a lot of biology 101 courses will cover things like genetics and cell biology, as well as some physiology, which is covered on the MCAT. But something like a dedicated human physiology course can also really elevate your understanding of some of the fundamentals that are tested on the MCAT. I think that's something that's important to consider too, is that while there is fundamental knowledge which is tested, there also is a strategy to understanding the MCAT, understanding how to interpret questions, having good test-taking skills. And those typically aren't things that are going to be covered in your college curriculum. And so if test taking in itself is something that you really want to focus on, that may be something to focus on outside of just your standard biology or chemistry.
Costner covered it.
All right. Amazing. Okay. We have one last question and then I think we will go. How important would you say it is to take recommended courses? I know we've kind of gone over this, but how does it impact your application? What does it tell admissions officers about you as a student?
I think there are a few ways to answer this question. I think on one hand, recommended, so you have your required courses and then your recommended courses. Your required courses, you really need to be taking those courses, because if you don't fulfill those requirements, you're really going to be ruled out. And then in terms of recommended courses, I feel like those are an area for you to really show yourself as a full-fledged, interesting applicant. And so that's a time for you to really pursue interest outside of those required courses. And so as we had mentioned, if you're interested in economics, if you're interested in art, you really should feel empowered to participate in those courses and expand your learning. As Sanjay had mentioned before, we aren't all just living in a bucket of science and science and biological sciences as physicians. We all have other interests. We are working with patients that also have other interests. And so being a full-fledged applicant with other interests or hobbies outside of science is really only going to help you.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that in terms of the recommended science courses, if you perform super well in a very high level science course that's not a prerequisite, it could demonstrate to an admissions committee that like you are competent in the sciences. But at the same time, your MCAT score can also do that without taking that class. So it's not that you have to do these things, but they can.
And one last thing, which I just thought of, kind of going off of Sanjay's comment, is if there are higher level courses that you really excel in, or that you really are able to foster a strong relationship or rapport with a professor, that might be a great point for you to get a letter of recommendation as well. Especially with a lot of higher level courses, for example, classes that might be seminar style. So rather than having 200, 300 people in Chemistry 101, all of a sudden you're in a seminar with 10 people and you're able to foster a stronger relationship with a professor who can then vouch for you as you're looking for letters of recommendation to supplement your application.
Amazing. Yes. Do you have anything else to add, Sanjay?
No, I was just going to say, I'm so glad that Costner said that's very, very true.
Yes. Amazing. Thank you guys so much. That's going to be the end of our webinar for today. Thank you, Sunjay and Costner, for joining us and sharing your words of wisdom. I sure learned a lot, and I hope you did too. All right, so we're going to get going. If you guys have any specific questions, feel free to send us an email or book a free consultation if that's something that you are interested in doing. And we will see you at the next one.